Sometimes it's like I'm watching myself. Like I'm outside.
Ka hoi hoi ngā reo. E tauronarona ana.
The challenges I face. The decisions I make. Should I?
Me pērā.
I want to be.
They want me to be.
I pretend to
pretend to be.
But if I listen harder,
Ka rongo.
I hear myself. Navigating the DMs. The conversations with my kaiako.
Te tautoko mai a taku whānau.
It's connected.
And I can take a breath.
And then I'm inside. Standing, feet firm on the ground.
Me he pou.
Strong, proud, grounded.
He mahoi.
From here I can go anywhere. Find my own path.
Tōku tuakiritanga.
Whatever comes,
I know myself.
I am ready.
Kia ora, talofa lava, and welcome to our follow-up webinar on vaping and responding to students in a school setting. We're absolutely thrilled that you've come back to join us again today. Just a couple of things before we get started. What Ben and I are going to be your main presenters today. We're going to try and get through the content as quickly as we can to enable a really robust Q&A time at the end of the presentation. So we had a real flurry of questions in the last few minutes of our presentation last week. What I'd really like to encourage you to do is just post your questions throughout our kōrero, and that way we'll capture them all and we'll be able to really intentionally and with a lot of thought respond to those at the end of our presentation. Also, thank you for participating in the poll. We did have a clear kind of area that you wanted us to look into in regards to another webinar series. So we're just pulling together the speakers and the format for that, and we're hoping to have that released with some dates for you in the next 4 to 6 weeks. So please watch this space. Look, it's really great to be here today with you and my colleague Ben. For those of you who don't know me, I've got a background in youth mental health and addictions. I'm a registered DAPANS or addictions practitioner and clinical supervisor. I've joined Drug Foundation as the Learning and Development Director, and in my prior role, I was the Chief Executive at a youth one-stop shop in Tūtaroo, where one of the key roles was school-based health services and a range of services, including youth work, mental health support, and nursing within the school setting. Part of that challenge was really learning how to be very nuanced in responding to vaping. And so this presentation, we will be talking through some of those situations that we've come across. I've also done my doctorate in looking at drug policies in schools, so really feel confident in the evidence base that is informing this kōrero with you today. It's really been my pleasure working with Drug Foundation for the last three months, and I'm stoked to be working with such incredible colleagues, including Ben Birks, who is our Deputy Executive Director. Sorry, Ben. And again, like Ben and I, despite how youthful we look, we've had a career of about 20 years in the youth addiction space. And so it's awesome just to be doing this with you today, Ben. So welcome, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks, Annabel. And like has been mentioned, my name is Ben Birks. I'm the Deputy Director in charge of programs here at the New Zealand Drug Foundation. Been working in the drug and alcohol space for around about 20 years, most of that time working with secondary schools as part of the pastoral care team, including some time managing youth residential programs, young adult programs, and community-based programs and supporting people back into work after they've had a treatment episode. So really excited to be able to share some of this whakaaro with you today.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. So what our intention is for this presentation is really to talk through with you what a whole of school approach is, what are the learning opportunities and how to build those into the school environment, how to strengthen and utilise support pathways within your school, and some tips and tricks around some things that we've tried and that have been really effective, how to also link policies and procedures. And as I said in the beginning, really ensuring that we've got some great time for your questions towards the end. Now, just for a bit of context, really, and to link in last week's presentation with this week's presentation, just a little bit of a refresh around what Tutaroo is. So Tutaroo is a uniquely Aotearoa program that is designed to really bring health and education together. Often what we find is health works with students when there's been an issue arise, and education when that issue happens, we don't really know what to do. Tutaroo has got a range of resources that we talked a bit through last week. And this week, we're going to kind of take a bit more of a deeper dive into that. Tutaroo has also been robustly and independently evaluated. And one of the key findings from that evaluation is that it's really helped schools shift from a punitive to a pastoral response. So I'll hand over to you, Ben, to run us through some of the strategies for responding to young people in the school context. Thanks.
Fantastic. So just starting off here, looking at what we're focusing on today, if you're a school here looking to review or to strengthen how you help students learn and be well, that at any point in time is useful, regardless of whether your school or community sees vaping as a major issue or not. And I think probably one of the big factors in this decision or this discussion at the moment is that schools are required to be a smoke and vape-free environment. So regardless of what the issue looks like for individual young people, this is something that schools are facing. And I'm reflecting on my time managing a youth residential centre or a couple of youth residential centres where young people would come in from using multiple different types of substances, and we had that same requirement that it had to be a smoke-free environment. I know the challenges that are there in supporting young people to make changes, and also being required to provide that environment where young people can do that in a smoke-free space. So let's have a look at some of the stuff in a school environment. Here we know that there are different parts of a school. So we can see this inverted triangle that features throughout a lot of the education sector, where we've got all students filling that part at the top. Health education with its health, with its learning outcomes is the main outcome that we're looking for in those areas. And regardless of what health topic you put over the top of this, there'll be some students who need a little bit of support and a few students who need intensive support on top of that. What we really know is that these responses work best when all of those approaches are aligned. And we definitely need that there to be in place at the start when we're looking at the whole school approach, because sometimes the school culture and the school way of dealing with a situation can impact on that critical thinking development, or what can be covered within a classroom activity. One of the things I think when I think about kind of whole school approaches and school responses to health issues is this quote from a principal: "It takes time for students to connect what they learn with their lives." And we know this is really true. The more that the school's approach to health topics or well-being is aligned, the more students can take what they cover in their classroom and understand how that's applied. If it's out of alignment with how the school deals with health topics, or their disciplinary process or their pastoral care process, for example, is out of alignment with what they're covering in the classroom, then it becomes much, much harder for those students to be able to connect with what they learn in those classrooms with their lives outside of there. And this is most crucial for those young people who their out of school environment may not necessarily be giving them the skills and competencies that they require to live healthy and successful lives. And I think, for example, those students who have come from households where they've got parents who are working multiple jobs trying to get enough money to be able to keep the keep the family going, they may not have as much opportunity to be able to see some of those positive, healthy living competencies role modeled at at home, sorry, and they're the ones who need that so much more from that formal environment at school. So again, looking at that kind of inverted triangle that we have here of everybody in the school environment, we know that schools can be these ecosystems of learning and support, and we're trying to get students, helping them to achieve by getting support quickly and easily if they need it. So essentially, anytime that we're talking about a whole school approach or a school-wide approach, what we're talking about is aligning what students experience in the school environment that helps them to develop, aligning what they learn in the classroom, how they're supported at school when issues arrive, how professional services might provide additional support, and also outside of that, how the wider community of school, their whānau, and their services can help to them to lead healthy and successful lives. And recognizing that actually schools and health services are positioned quite far apart. Often health services will see those few students who are in need of professional health support external to a school. And what we know is that those young people, those few at that tip of the triangle, require different types of information, require different types of support than what every student in that school environment would require, or what may be required as part of their health education. Vaping as a relatively new substance or method of use onto the scene in recent years, we're recognizing that we're trying to fit that within existing schema. And I think for all of the schools in here, thinking about your approach to vaping at the moment, are you doing this through avoiding, through reacting, or are you moving towards preparing? I think the challenge that we have here is that our common traditional ways of working in terms of alcohol and other drugs has often been dealing with it through a disciplinary process or through pastoral care after an incident has happened, which means that the schemas that we're trying to fit vaping into are usually ones that are more on that avoiding or reacting side of things rather than the preparing. So I guess the most important thing for vaping is to take the whole range of adolescent behaviors into account to avoid pushing those conversations underground or inadvertently steering people to riskier or more harmful things. I'm going to bring forward one slide from last week to be able to remind us of where things fit in. But I think for us here, when we take a whole school approach or take a positive youth development approach, recognizing that every young person is making decisions about whether they use substances or not. Many will try it, some will experience problems with short-term harms, and a few young people will experience extreme or long-term harms. How we as the adults respond to that can have a greater impact on a young person's life trajectory than the substance use itself. So for example, if a young person becomes disengaged from education, that is going to have a much greater impact on their life than the substances that may have led to that point. So here is kind of where vaping looks. I've highlighted the ones that are in green here for ever trying a vape. At the top, the use of e-substances at least once a month, and daily e-cigarette users down the bottom. So this bit here is a slide that Ben Uden from ASH covered last week, but looking at the indicators of health status for 15 to 17-year-olds from the New Zealand Health Survey. And this is where vaping fits in. So for those of you who are here from schools, reflecting on which part of this is concerning for you. And I think the most important thing to remember here is that when we're talking to young people, take the whole range of behaviors into account. We see sometimes where if there's one topic that gets the whole bulk of attention, then sometimes young people, as they're developing their kind of health and wellbeing competencies, the things that cover the biggest classroom attention are the ones that they think are the riskiest behaviors, and ones that don't have as much classroom attention, if it's a kind of topic by topic approach, then they perceive to be less risky or less harmful. So I think whenever we're building that health learning program, making sure that we're talking about all of these range of health adolescent behaviors in one go, and making sure that we can spend some time deep diving with some of them. Starting off at the top of that kind of whole school approach, where we're looking at the foundation, this is ultimately a positive school environment where students feel like they belong and like their well-being is important. We know from evaluations of whole school approaches, so this one is a quote from the Gatehouse Project, which was one over in Australia that took a whole school approach to mental health, that one of the crucial parts for it is having an explicit focus around the positive school environment, or what they were calling the school climate, and for student connectedness as well. And they found that through that evaluation that it was equally, if not more effective in addressing health and problem behaviors than specific single issue focused education packages. And that's definitely something that we have found here in Aotearoa as well. I can think about my time working in pastoral care teams in schools, where I could tell the difference between the different schools that I was working in. If a school had a very prominent and visible focus on student well-being, then that it was much easier to work with the students. They were able to make changes a lot quicker than those schools where they didn't have that very explicit focus. And in fact, in those schools where they didn't have the explicit focus on well-being, and students weren't sure around whether their well-being was important or if that could push them towards a disciplinary pathway, we spent more time trying to find out what the actual situation was, because the young people were much more cautious about what they would share with people, and less likely to engage with the school pastoral care team to be able to get that support. Just seeing one of the comments come through that the quality of slides is difficult to read on their screen, and absolutely you can get a copy of these slides afterwards. One of the things that we know here is engaging or re-engaging young people in supportive environments or positive activities is really crucial, especially for those times where young people don't necessarily want to make changes. What that does is it gives a whole lot of structured activity outside of school that they can be involved with. It exposes them to a different set of peers as well. So if they're in a peer group who start to disengage from school over time, they then, if they've been involved in these other activities, have another peer group that they could turn to as well to spend some more time with. If they haven't got those activities, or they haven't got those peer groups that can show them different norms, different social activities and that kind of stuff, it becomes much harder for them to be able to make changes at that point. So one of the crucial things that we can do here is making sure that young people have as many opportunities as possible. One thing to consider in your schools is, if an incident arises, what does that then mean for young people's ability to participate in these activities? Does it increase their opportunities, or does it decrease their opportunities? And there's some data to be able to back up just how effective this is here. So here's an example of that for young people who have been affected by adverse childhood experiences. So these are those young people who may have very traumatic backgrounds, that things like team sports participation was associated with much better adult mental health. So there is evidence that backs up the experience and the exposure of these activities, even if they're not necessarily directly targeting the health behavior itself. So now we'll look into what to pull into different classrooms. So here I'm just going to point to the resource that I'm going to cover in a little bit of detail in this presentation. This one talks about the marketing of energy drinks and vaping. We know that thinking critically about well-being fits nicely as part of the health learning area. So before we get into the resource, which is freely downloadable from the Tutaroo website, and I'll cover it in the next few slides, let's have a look at what that health learning area looks like. Last time this was monitored, we know that 2/3 of Year 8 students were below the expected level of achievement for their age. So they're missing out on competencies such as identifying the effects of changing situations, roles, and responsibilities on, and being able to describe appropriate responses, being able to describe and demonstrate a range of assertive communication skills and processes that enable them to interact appropriately with other people, and also to be able to specify the individual responsibilities and take collective action for the care and safety of other people in their community. These competencies, when we think back around what Ben Newton covered last week, and about how a lot of that entry into vaping is through curiosity and through exploring what they may see other young people doing, these competencies become really, really important for young people to have mastered so that they know how to navigate that situation. I think the challenge that we have here, and here's a graph of kind of what it looks like. For those of you who are here as part of schools, we're looking at level 4 in the New Zealand curriculum as the kind of area that students should be in at about this year 8, year 9 stage. So if 2/3 of year 8 students are entering into high school, missing out on these kind of competencies, one thing for your school to consider is how much time have you got dedicated in your curriculum to support your health teachers to identify those learning needs, to identify if they are back in level 2 or level 3, and adjusting your learning program to make sure that those competencies can be addressed and picked up in there. We've seen it before where for young people who enter into a learning program that is mostly based around knowledge transfer or sharing of facts, if they've missed out on these competencies, such as that second one, communicating with other people when you've got a difference of opinion, it becomes really, really hard for them to know how to make sense of that knowledge and information and integrate it into their life and how they do things. Really recognizing that, like we were talking about earlier, it takes time for students to be able to connect what they learn in their classroom with the life outside of there. And I know just how hard it is in many schools to be able to get that time booked in for the health learning area. So this particular resource here, looking at marketing of energy drinks and vaping, it's aimed at curriculum levels 4 and 5. There's one example activity in there as a framework for senior students. It challenges students to think critically about the direct and indirect messages that they're hearing. Vaping and energy drinks are the two learning contexts that are in there, but recognizing that many different learning contexts could be used and also could be used within the same learning program, because it focuses on those competencies of thinking critically about it and responding in ways that promote well-being. It's been written by Dr. Jenny Robertson, who many people in this call will know, who's been on the exec of the New Zealand Health Education Association for many years, and it's been trialled and reviewed by many other teachers across Aotearoa. So one thing to remember as I cover just a really high level what these activities look like, they can be tailored, used individually, or can be incorporated into your existing program. And like Annabel was saying earlier, rather than having vaping as kind of the standalone project, we really recommend integrating vaping as one of the contexts that you use to cover within your health learning program, so that it takes into account the whole range of adolescent behaviors there. There is some recommended prior learning for this. This will be clearer as I go through the activities that are in the guide, but understanding the concept of holder first, understanding that there are personal, interpersonal, and societal factors that influence well-being and the choices people make, knowing the values of respect and fairness, having some personal self-management skills and interpersonal communication skills, and having practice at using critical thinking to analyze scenarios or consider different perspectives. So when you keep those recommended prior learnings in mind, that can help you to figure out where to place this within your learning program. So activity 1, the suggested activity 1, is looking at what we know already. So what we have in here is the suggested one is using continuums to identify what students have heard, seen, or experienced through here. There are some examples in there of the continuum statements. There's 2 pages of these examples in the guide. You probably will have continuums that you use already in this space. And again, like, integrate these with other things. So it might be a handful of continuum statements for vaping as well as other health topics that are in there. This one has whether you want to do it in your classroom, is arranging them to stand at some point along the continuum, from definitely agreeing to definitely disagreeing with some space in the middle, or ticking a box like this if you want people to be able to be a little bit more private or self-reflective or in groups. You'll know what will work for your classroom the most. And the idea of this as a teacher is to look at what the learning needs of students are based on their experiences to complement your own assessment of their level of competence within the health learning area and integrate both of them together. Another alternative for this is using some of the data covered in the webinar last week, which can help you, particularly if you're introducing that to more senior students where, or at the part in your health learning program where students are learning how to critique whether information is accurate or not. An example way, so each of these activities in there, like I said, they can be used standalone, and they each have a suggestion for how to wrap it up. So that positions the student as the director of their own learning. And the example given for activity 1 is thinking, one thing I realized I knew about vaping was, and one thing I realized I did not know about vaping was this. What the continuum statements do is they help young people to see really visibly in front of them that there'll be different people in class who have different experiences. And you as a teacher can back that up by saying, by reinforcing that everybody is making their own mind up. We know that for young people, when they come to school and they see, for example, in the alcohol space, they hear from that group there that they've been drinking. The next weekend, they hear from that group over there that they've been drinking, and from another group that they hear that they've been drinking. It can feel like everybody is doing that and drinking in this example. And we also know that people tend to hang out with other people who are doing the same thing that they are as well. So having the opportunity to be able to pull out and critically examine what is actually normal and what those social norms are is really important too. Activity 2 is, what does the data say? So the suggested activity in this guide is using a survey and compare approach. So you may have a survey, or you may have this kind of stuff that you do in your health classes already. If you do, great. It could just be a couple of vaping questions inside of that as well. So this one here asks students what they think the level of vaping is among New Zealand school students. Why? There's a survey form that is a template as part of that guide, and they can compare it with the data from the ASH survey results. So it uses the same questions there. The reason that was given as an example is that if your school has participated in the ASH survey, you'll be able to have those results already. And if not, you can contact ASH to be able to grab that data for them. Some of the critical thinking questions that they can have is, how similar or different are your classes or your school's results to the New Zealand data? And why do you think that is the case? As an optional one, there's some data in the guide around what things look like in the United States. So they could be doing that comparison of, what does this look like in New Zealand compared to the United States? Why? And given what we know about vaping, how concerned should we be? So part of this is taking what was learned in the previous session, that everybody has different opinions, different ways of looking at things. And this one is doing that kind of comparison of, what do we see here? What do we see compared to the data? Why? What's the personal response? What is the critical thought that we can pull out of this one? One thing to consider in this one is, for those of you who are here as health teachers or in your school, does your school's approach to well-being allow for critical thinking in this context? So if you've been very black and white around vaping is, for example, is really inappropriate, is really harmful, will that allow students to be able to explore the data in the sense to be able to think more about it? Some other questions to be able to think about is, how would you do the survey safely in your classroom, and how you might use it to be able to identify learning needs and experiences students in their community, and how you might build that into your learning program. And again, as we keep talking about the whole way through, what other health topics could you use this health approach with? And we know some schools have generated the same survey on compare approach, where they've created a survey that has some data from things like the Youth 2019 or Youth 2000 secondary survey, to be able to compare some of that data to as well. So one of the suggested wrap-ups to be able to pull that together into learning moments for those students, and they'll each have their own individual personal response to this, is their class or school data was or was not similar to the survey that they compared it to. I think that this is because of this, as something that students can write in their learning journals. Moving on now into activity 3 and 4. So these are about analyzing advertising and indirect marketing. I'm going to start first with analyzing advertisements. There are simpler versions for this in the resource that talk about kind of the advertising techniques that people might use. But the example that I've put in here is one that is really, really appropriate for senior students in particular, with the level of critical thought that it has, that it's asking them. And I also want to note here that the legislation has changed. So there are now heavy restrictions on the advertising of vapes and electronic cigarettes that wasn't around a couple of years ago. So here over on the right-hand side, I've just put a couple of examples of what those advertisements looked like overseas for Juul, which was one of the brands for vapes. And here are some of the questions that you can take your class through. So where might you see advertising for vaping? Who created it and what do you think was their intent? What methods are they using to grab attention? Is this things like humor, bold claims, extreme views, relatable characters? Is their message factual and is there bias? How do you know this and what information would be needed to decide this? What impact could this have on people's lives and well-being? And what health promoting actions could be taken? So again, I'll point out that in the resource, there are simpler versions for junior students. And you'll know as a health teacher where your class's level of critical thought development is and which version might be more appropriate. This bit in here really goes into detail for some of those media literacy techniques. And another part to point out about this, when we've covered this in some schools, that third question down, we've seen some of the English teachers in the room say, actually, I cover this on a regular basis in my classes. So maybe we could make sure that it's timed around the same time so students get introduced to this in their health class, we deepen it and also cover that same material over in our English classes. And the same thing for that fourth point down about whether the message is factual and if there's bias. That's commonly, we hear from maths teachers that they cover it in their classes as well. The more that there can be those real life learning opportunities that reinforce and back up the learning from each other across those different subjects, the easier it is for students to connect that learning that they get in the classroom with their lives outside of there. Although in saying that, definitely know how hard it is to be able to arrange for the integrated learning across different classrooms or different learning areas, and how challenging it is to be able to timetable it all in together. We have had some schools who have done that, tried that more with junior classes, where there was a little bit more flexibility to be able to do that kind of top-up learning. And one example that I like to give when I talk about that is going to English to talk about the kind of well-being topic that they want to do and pull that into a question, going to maths to learn about how to get some of the data around it and learn how to graph it, going to health for some top-up knowledge to help them to do a personal response to that, and then back to English where they say it back to, they present it in a speech back to their class. And hearing from the schools who do use that kind of approach, they've really spoken about how that's then those students have 3 teachers who have role modeled to them that it's okay and appropriate to talk about well-being topics and that their well-being in real life is important at school. So later on in the year down the track, it's more likely that students will talk about issues earlier so that they can get support from people like a dean or a school counsellor rather than waiting till issues are larger. Here are some of the indirect messages. So there's one suggested teaching method that uses scenarios in the resource as well. And students discuss how could this influence young people to use or not use vaping products, whether they think it is fair to young people, why or why not. And there are some example scenarios in there, things like a school team is given free gear to wear at an event, for example, a vaping product branded t-shirt or cap, or a popular youth-oriented TV program often features vaping product brands being consumed by characters in the program. So those scenarios to be able to look at the indirect messages. I've copied across in the picture on the right, and I can recognize that probably if you're dialing in from your phone, then you won't be able to see those. But these are, again, broadening out from just vaping. There's a little a little bit of social media advertising there, the indirect messages that young people will see through mainstream media, looking at news articles, the Instagram one there, that was a promotion that was being used by an alcohol company, where they were saying that people could pose naked holding their product with the tag line that they were going for in the promotion, and they could go on the draw to win prizes. So then essentially those young people are becoming brand ambassadors for the product as well. So in this space, using those kind of scenarios helps students to see the marketing techniques that are being used and explore them. And again, like I've said the whole way throughout, I'd recommend using a range of different health examples to be able to teach the core concept, which is understanding the media literacy within that. You'll see from the student discussion about whether they think it's fair to young people or not, and why or why not. That's some of that pre-learning that we spoke about, those values of fairness and responsibility is important in there too for young people to have before they do these suggested classes. Oops, there was one more scenario there. A popular radio station with a known youth audience has shows sponsored by vaping brands. So activity 3 and 4 suggested wrap up is, our group found these things from our analysis, and I think this is fair or unfair to young people because, as their way of pulling that learning together. I won't go into it in more detail in this case, but there are 3 further activities in the resource. This is about taking individual action, collective action, and there's one in there for helping senior students do a student investigation in that process too. Awesome. So this section here, I'm going to hand back to Annabel for what if students need support in here. I'm just going to, I've been speaking a lot and I haven't been keeping track of the comments that have been coming through. So dropping in here. Perfect. Thanks, Jessica. I can see your comments here, and Annabel will answer them here, and anything else that you wanted us to cover, we can do that in question and answers, which will be just after this. Kia ora, Annabel, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Look, I think one of the key things that will hopefully be coming through for you is the importance around connecting the dots within the school environment for students, and that there is a need for students to have progressive learning opportunities throughout their time in education. So one of the ways, and Ben and I are going to be tag teaming the slides because he's got control of the buttons. So we need a symbol, Ben. Nice work. Thank you. I don't have my people about that. We're learning as we go. So what we really know is that in the school environment, it's really, really important that the values, the teaching and learning curriculum, and how we respond when a student does present with a challenge, a health challenge, that those are connected and that there is consistent messaging that happens throughout the different areas that the school or that the young person may have interface with. One of the areas that we do some work in regards to developing confidence for teachers is around a conversation around, are you okay? What we've seen in schools is that often there'll be a small group of teachers that can carry the load or feel like they carry the load of responsibility around checking in if students' well-being is okay. In those situations, sometimes then there isn't a good understanding around what the scope is and when to refer and who to refer on to. So one of the things we like to do with schools is to develop an understanding around how to have that conversation so that all teachers feel confident asking the question, are you okay? They know what their scope is. They know when to refer on to another area of the school or to external support if that is needed. We also know from the student's perspective that when questions around are you okay happen from multiple places in the school, the students feel like they are seen and they feel like they are cared for. And when we circle that back to some of the data, what that tells us is that is a key indicator for students' engagement in school is a sense of connectedness. So next slide, please. What we also know, what this slide shows us, is that nicotine is also most readily available through cigarettes. Vape juice is designed to be used over a period of time. And when we're looking at nicotine withdrawal, it's really important to get a clear understanding around what the level of nicotine going into that young person's system is, not necessarily how many times a day they are vaping, because vape juice varies in regards to the nicotine levels. The next area I want to kind of go into is what nicotine withdrawal looks like, and then I'm going to talk through some of the strategies. So what we know is that there's really 4 stages of nicotine addiction. The first is that there are no withdrawal symptoms. The second is, oh my goodness, I really want it and I'd really like it now. The third is craving. Oh, I'm so distracted, I can't think of anything else but having a vape, and I need that nicotine in my system now. And the fourth is needing. One of the key indicators of this is somebody will get up and need to have a vape within 5 minutes of waking. The strategies are actually the same, whether a young person is addicted physiologically or not. We deal with it in the same way. What I wanted to do here was briefly talk about what cravings are and how they kind of present. So what we know is that cravings tend to be like a wave. So they'll have a peak and then they'll dissipate. The other thing that we know is cravings are like a stray cat. Like if you keep feeding that cat, it's going to keep coming back and make itself at home in your whare, whether you want it or not. So what we want to do is we also know that cravings last for a short period of time. So when we want to look at strategies, we want strategies that are quick and that can support the young person working through the peak of that craving and get it moving through more quickly. A really simple and easy strategy to remember is what we call the 4 Ds. So where we delay, so we work at delaying the use when there is a craving. We want to look at drinking water because we know for a whole range of reasons that that is a really useful thing to do in terms of dealing with dehydration, in terms of flushing the system out. We want to look at distraction techniques. Whatever that might look like would be great. I always try and get young people to do burpees and they look horrified, but whatever. And also we know breathing is also a really effective strategy. Awesome. Thanks, Ben. We'll move on to the next slide. When we are working with young people and when they are presenting with concerns around vaping, or they've come out of class because they're just really hanging out for a vape, what I'd really like to encourage people to do is to really look at what are the risk and protective factors in that profile for that young person, because this does allow us some strategies that we can lean on and some alternative intervention pathways that we can look at exploring. I also think it's really important that we remember that the majority of young people are, well, what the data tells us anyway, are engaging with vaping in a way that is about curiosity. And from my experience, young people are exploring it as a way to emotionally regulate. So if we peel that back, one of the really useful things to do is have a corridor with young people around emotional regulation strategies. And one of the ones that I think is a quick and easy and evidence-based method to fall back onto is the 5 senses. So looking at working through with young people what they see, hear, feel, smell, and can touch, and get them to name that. That's a lovely grounding technique. It also works as, if we go back to the 4Ds, it also works to distract and delay their craving. So it can be a multifaceted approach. Sorry, I'm really trying to race, folks. So then Tutaroo has also developed, again, because we like to connect the dots, a support plan. Now, we've only got a picture up of the first step of the support plan because we didn't want the slides to be too overwhelming. But this is designed for the Aotearoa context. So when we are looking at step 1, which is reflecting on wellbeing, we are taking a hauora perspective in regards to that kōrero. The second step is around encouraging the young person to think critically. Now, this is really, really important if we also have a restorative practice within the school, because this allows for the young person to be prepared for that restorative hui. There's also a template for how to build a plan. So what are they going to do in the future to manage this situation differently? And who's their support team and what is it that they need to know? These are really, really useful to be built into the year 9 and 10 health. It's a great way to pave a wellbeing kōrero with a new cohort of students and set them up for their time within the school environment. We also know this is really well aligned to the health competencies. One of the other areas that we also encourage schools to look at is what their policy environment is like, because all of these things that we're talking about are really fundamental for developing students' critical thinking to navigate health-based decisions that they make throughout their lifespan. However, in the school environment, if the policies are different, and I don't know why my slides aren't changing, sorry folks, thanks. Could we skip through to the policy ones, please? Thank you. So if the policies don't align with the curriculum, then as Ben said earlier, what happens is students won't necessarily feel safe to engage in a critical kōrero. What's the next slide? And again, I really love this quote. How adults respond has a greater impact on a young person's life trajectory than the substance use itself. And I think in the context of vaping, what's really important is if we come back to that students, the majority of students will be using this for because of curiosity. So how we respond at that point does have a significant impact. Thank you. Next slide. And look, this was a really insightful quote from a young person that participated in my doctoral thesis. And essentially what they are saying is they want schools to respond to them like it is a learning opportunity. They want support and they want to know that they can have a kōrero about drug use or about vaping or alcohol within the school environment without being treated like they're criminals. There's a range of resources available from the Tūturu website that also look at the kind of the macro level framing that needs to happen for your response as well as your teaching curriculum to be as good as it possibly can be. So this is the Board of Trustees training, pastoral support, and the whole school approach training material. So I've worked through that and I think I've managed to segue back to Ben and it's some Q&A time. So thanks everybody. Look forward to your questions.
Awesome. And I think as the questions are just being loaded up that came through in the comment, one of the most important parts of this is going, what are you trying to do within your school? Not just focusing on the few students that might need more of a professional support. When you're thinking about that every student level, that's about that critical thinking development and making sure that your health learning area is as strong as it can be to support young people to think critically about their well-being, regardless of the health topic it is. But introducing the context of learning that reflect your community and the concerns within your community that come through that that health consultation that gets done every 2 years. For the some students like who are starting to explore what Annabel was talking about, those approaches that could be done in there through a school counsellor. And if those of you in this webinar are school counsellors and want to talk about those techniques in more detail, feel free to let us know and we can run you through them and how we've used them in the past. And also then for the few students who are in there, forming those partnerships with smoke-free services. And I can see in the comments that in some areas of the country that's a little bit harder to do than others. I think one of the most important things here is really understanding why that young person is using, because I know sometimes, and I'm going to use the example of this when I was doing nicotine replacement therapy with some young people using patches and lozenges, is that if we didn't match the nicotine levels in those patches and lozenges right for that young person and put them on a lower dose than they were needing, they actually ended up needing more and more of those patches or lozenges or gums throughout the day to try and alleviate those withdrawal symptoms that they were getting, and ended up having more nicotine than they would do otherwise. So making sure you understand for that young person the nicotine level where they're at and matching it appropriately is really important. Can see the questions coming through now. So this one here is the data applicable to immersion Māori statistics. I'm guessing this is the data around that right from the start around that health, critical thinking and health that I was talking about. That data was done in from the National Monitoring Survey. By the way, if you're wanting to look at it in more detail, there's great breakdowns on the website for it. It is only for English medium schools. There's separate reviews that are done for Māori immersion schools. For the kura who we've spoken to around this, they've got really, really amazing relationships with hapu, with whānau and stuff like that. And so that side of things, that connection with whānau and hapu wasn't necessarily the challenge for them. What they were finding challenging was having the content in their classroom that was already translated into te reo for them to explore and cover in that one. So we're trying to work with some of them around that one. Regional staff who work in this space that we can connect with. Yes. What we are doing now, so Tutaroo, we started as a pilot a few years ago, and the pilot finished just as COVID was hitting. We've had a couple of years of figuring out how to do things in this current COVID situation, and we are in the process now of contracting and expanding our number of Tutaroo providers. Those Tutaroo providers will be local health organisations in different communities across Aotearoa. Most of them will be drug and alcohol services, although there will be a mix in there of other types of services, and we'll be working on upskilling them so that they can work with schools in that area. We know that this shouldn't be an area that schools focus on their own, and having another organisation in their community who understands this, who can help them to create their own unique response to health and wellbeing concerns for their students and their communities is really important. You can find the places where we are on tutaroo.org.nz, and feel free to get in touch with us directly through that website if you haven't found a provider in that area, and we can talk you through some of that kind of stuff too.
Kia ora, thanks Ben.
Cool. And I can see in the comments this one here, the agencies that we can connect with regarding Quit Vape programs for students who are using. I can see the comments explaining the challenges across the country around this area.
Yeah.
My understanding is that is very similar to what was there in the comments, that smoke-free organisations are funded to be able to support people to reduce their reliance on cigarettes, and that there may be some discussion that they could do around vaping and some discussion that they can do around nicotine levels, but supporting a young person who is only vaping and isn't doing that as a way off cigarette smoking is something for that service to decide whether it's within their scope. I can also see a couple of comments in there around addiction services. I can say this is somebody who has worked in youth addiction services for many years. They get funded for the top 3% of harm, or young people who experience the top 3% of harm, and often have long waiting lists themselves to be able to see students. So my guess is that a lot of them will be finding it challenging to be able to keep up with the needs of things like the alcohol use, cannabis use, for a very few number of young people, methamphetamine use and stuff like that as well. And it may be that vaping for them is a lower priority to be able to get support for students. But I think remember that we have been supporting young people for many years through things like gums and lozenges, e-cigarettes for a little while. So we know that a lot of that craving management, when you deliver that in a way where you understand why the young person is using and what's keeping them in that situation, can support them to reduce their use.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. And there was another comment in the chat around discipline processes getting overwhelmed by the number of students being stood down because of vaping. So I think just to kind of bring that into the context of this kōrero, what is at the heart of Tutaroo and what we're encouraging people to do is move away from those punitive responses and look at how we can create a learning opportunity and a dialogue with students to support the competencies to be developed so that they're able to make better informed health-based decisions. We know that punitive responses undermine students' sense of connectedness. It undermines school climate indicators. So we're really looking at developing a really comprehensive way of responding to students' health-based issues that sit outside of a punitive-based response. So I see and I hear the pressure that stand downs are under, and I guess this is one way to look at reducing that pressure. But look, we're kind of quickly running out of time. I'm not sure if there are any other burning questions that people have.
I think one thing just to chuck in there, if your school is coming up to your time where you'll do the consultation with the school community around the house learning area, that could be a time to talk with your community to find out the level of nicotine exposure that your students are likely to get, whether it's through cigarette smoking or vaping. Because one thing that we want to be able to protect in this is the ability to use vaping as smoking cessation, particularly for adults who need that approach, or who that approach is effective of. And one of the things that we don't want to do is to alienate students from that critical thinking discussion in the classroom if they can see their parents or their aunties or their uncles, for example, switching away from cigarette use and moving into vaping. We want to have a kind of balanced discussion in there where they can get some of the ideas around it, explore, critique, and match it against their experience. And I think the other part to throw in here is that we know that the most regular daily use of vaping is happening in communities with the highest exposure to nicotine. So making sure that it's positioned as a smoking cessation tool, and that the discussion around it is how it can be effective for that, and also not something that we want people who haven't been smoking to pick up and use, can be some of the pragmatic style of making sure there's a balanced view taught in the classroom and in the school's response. And also noting schools don't have to do this on their own. I can see some of the comments coming through. There are public health officers who are now looking at implementing and enforcing the regulations that have just come through as well. So those regulations are still relatively new. They still need some time to bed in, but definitely agree with the comments coming in. If there are vaping retailers who are breaking the law and doing that kind of stuff, letting your local public health service, smoke-free officer know so they can follow it up. You don't have to do this all on your own as a school.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's
Over to you,
awesome.
Annabel.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. There was one final piece around that students were resistant to learning about vaping. I guess our response would be start where students are at. And if they're interested in developing their critical thinking and health competencies in relation to another area of health, then let's go there. And as we've said, we've got resources available for alcohol and drug-based curriculum. So awesome that you all joined us. We really appreciate the time that you gave us today. We look forward to hearing from you. If you'd like to get in touch, please just drop us a line and we will put some comms out in the next few weeks in regards to our next webinar series. But we really look forward to seeing you there. So ngā mihi. Ka kite.
Ka kite.
Thanks, Ben.